This short audio story is from the Star Wars book, Myths and Fables, written by George Mann. The title of this story is The Silent Circle. This is the first story in the chronology of the Star Wars canon. On the planet Batuu, close to Black Spire Outpost, where the boughs of ancient trees tower like sentinels over all the land, there is one particular stand of trees, close to the ruins of a forgotten civilization in the hills, where the locals fear to tread. These ancient petrified trunks form an almost perfect circle, within which nothing grows and no one has ever sought to build. It is said that inside the clearing all sound is deadened, for the long-extinct trees emit a pervasive aura from their blackened trunks that discourages the presence of life. Yet there are those amongst the colonists who speak of another truth, that the trees, though long dead, retain a modicum of the spirit that once inhabited them, and that, if one is to visit them alone at night with pure intent, the trees will weave the sorrowful tale of their downfall. It is a woeful tale of the dim, distant past, from a time when the trees grew tall and vibrant, reaching so high that their leaves almost brushed the stars. According to those rare few who claim to have heard it, it goes something like this. At first there was only the water and the light. By day the trees drank deeply of both, and by night they grew ever taller, dominating the landscape, spreading their leaves and branches far and wide like outstretched fingers in the wind. They were alive and they were happy, brimming with the living force that weaves through all things. The trees whispered and conversed and pursued knowledge, for while they could see for kilometers in all directions, they knew nothing of the tiny creeping creatures that wormed in the soil below their roots, or the wriggling silver-scaled beasts of the sea. So it was that the trees agreed amongst themselves to nurture new life, and over many thousands of years, they shaped the world around them, nudging a little here, helping a little there, encouraging new life to flourish amongst their branches. In this way, over time, the trees saw a new species emerge. Small and slight, this species grew wings to become a race of fae, flitting among the treetops, chittering about all they had seen out in the wider world. The trees' thirst for knowledge was slaked, and they were satisfied with all they had done. The fae lived in perfect harmony with the trees and fed on their fruits, spreading their seeds far and wide across the land. In time, new trees grew, and these trees could see farther and wider than all the others, and spoke of distant mountains and verdant hills across the world. The trees and the fae had lived like this for some millennia, and by then the trees had grown inquisitive again, and wished to know of these new lands, and perhaps to plant their seeds amongst them too, to learn more of the world around them. So it was that the trees agreed to once again nurture new life, encouraging the crawling things that swarmed around their lower trunks. In time, these creatures grew bold and strong, pulling themselves up from the mud to feast on the green shoots of the lower branches of the trees. The trees watched, satisfied as the creatures grew larger, but it was still not enough. For to endure the journey to the distant hills, the creatures would need to move in great herds and be hardy enough to survive the migration. Thus, the trees grew their branches ever higher, so the creatures would have to grow ever taller to gain their sustenance, and in time, like the trees themselves, the creatures towered over the landscape. They were great hulking beasts with mossy backs and tusks designed to worry at the thick bark of the trees. As the beast flourished, they soon outgrew the forest, as the trees had anticipated they would, and began to wander farther afield until, at last, the distant pastures caught their eye, and the great migration began. The trees, anxious to learn more about this far-off land, had, while encouraging the beasts to grow, worked also to engender a blossoming intelligence in the fae, instilling within them a deep inquisitiveness and inventiveness that mirrored those of the trees themselves, so they might colonize the mossy backs of the great beasts, building nests and spreading far and wide with the creatures on their long journey. This way, the trees reasoned, the Fae might return to spread news of what they had seen and learned, and pass the seeds of new trees farther across the land. The trees watched as their progeny left in great herds, trailing roiling dust clouds in their wake. Yet some of the creatures, perhaps more cautious than the others, or perhaps simply comfortable with their lot, remained behind, and everything was peaceful, for the trees and the Fae and the beasts lived together in harmony. For many more years, life continued in this way, and the only sign the trees had that the migration had proved successful was the distant sight of growing saplings. They were happy, for they knew in time those trees would grow to become a forest of their own, and would look back whence they had come and share what knowledge they had gleaned of the mountains and the hills. Yet, as time went on and the new forest rose, the trees began to grow concerned, for the new forest was silent, and none of the Fae they had sent on the great migration had returned. Discouraged but anxious to understand what had become of their colony, they urged a small group of Fae to form an expedition and sent them off in the long, cold wake of the great migration to contact their former kin. Some years passed, however, and still the expedition did not return. Thus, the trees, wary of what had become of their emissaries, sent a second delegation. They, too, did not return. The only explanation the trees could fathom was that the new lands were so welcoming, the new forest so enticing, that both delegations had elected to stay, for they were free of mind and will, as all living things should be. So the trees agreed that this was not but a sign of the colony's success, and they should be proud of their achievements, for they had successfully helped propagate a paradise in the shadow of the distant mountains. In time, the trees forgot about their distant kin, and older and wiser and content with all they had learned of the land, they turned their attention to the ocean, for there, out amongst the azure waves, were islands of the brightest green where no tree had ever stood. Thus, they began by encouraging the great beasts to take to the waters, to learn to plow the waves, and in time the beasts gave up their claws and grew gills that would allow them to breathe and flippers that would enable them to swim. So too did the Fae adapt, growing great coral structures on the beasts' backs and learning to dive deep beneath the water in schools. Time passed, and the trees saw that the beasts and the Fae had succeeded, and that saplings grew on the green isles in the distant ocean, and all was well. And yet, just as before, the colony sent no word to the trees that had cultivated its existence. This time, the silence did not worry the trees, for they had seen its like before, and only good had come of their endeavors. Until, that was, a small group of Fae emissaries from the colony by the mountain at last arrived, bearing word from the new forest. At first the trees were delighted by the unexpected arrival, for they saw that the Fae had grown, adapting their habitats into whole cities of nests, which perched on the back of the shambling beast that had borne them across the plains. So anxious were the trees to finally hear word of their offspring that they openly welcomed the newcomers into their circle. Yet the newcomers did not come bearing news but demands, for they claimed the resources by the mountain had grown thin and feeble, and the soil was not rich enough to support the growing colony of trees. As the trees had been the ones to instill in their children such a pioneering spirit, such a deep need to expand, it should be they who came to the new colony's aid, sharing their resources so their offspring might survive. The trees knew this could never work, for their ecosystem was finely balanced, and if only the new colony could halt its expansion, then all would be well. Fae and beast and tree alike might flourish. The emissaries would hear nothing of this reason, however, and argued that if the resources were not granted willingly, then the new colony would raise banners of war and take what it needed by force. Appalled, the trees sent the emissaries away empty-handed, for they could not believe the threats were anything but hollow, that their progeny would ever move against them in such a violent fashion. Soon after, however, the trees saw signs of another great migration stirring at the foot of the mountain, and knew then that the threats had not been empty, and the new colony was mounting for war. Unsure what else to do, the trees sent word to their newest colony, down by the ocean, begging for assistance. But their messages went unheard, for the beasts of the sea and the trees on the islands had become insular and wished to have no contact with their ancestors on the mainland. Help would not be coming from the water. So it was that the trees began their own preparations for war, encouraging the Fae to even greater levels of inventiveness so they might erect defenses and stir the beasts into battle. When at last the colonists arrived in their swarms, the ensuing battle was like nothing the trees or the world had ever seen, as Fae and beast alike clashed amongst the boughs of the trees, attacking one another in a terrible onslaught. The battle lasted no more than a few days, but the results were devastating, and as the colonists pulled back to regroup, the original Fae, instilled with a deep passion for war, began to concoct new ways to not only repel, but defeat their enemies. The trees were appalled to see what had become of their creations, but there was little they could do to intervene, so the battle soon evolved into a protracted war between the Fae, with each side of the conflict devising ever greater means to wreak destruction on the opposing side. This war continued unabated for many, many years until, at last, those from the water, unable to stand by any longer, threw themselves into the conflict, seeking dominance over both the other colonies as a means of establishing peace. It was then that the trees finally realized their most dreadful error, for the Fae, so desperate to develop new weapons, had discovered the means to mine the living force of the trees themselves, using it to power their engines of destruction. The trees were powerless to protect themselves, and the Fae, lost to their own madness, listened not to the imprecations or appeals of their creators. Soon the upper branches of the trees began to wilt and die, becoming poisonous to the great beasts that fed on them, which in turn grew sick and died, depriving the Fae of their habitat and destabilizing all the work the trees had done. Where there had once been harmony, now there was discordance, and in the shortest time, the war had destroyed the entire ecosystem, and both the beasts and the Fae had been driven to extinction. The trees were alone and weak, for their connection to the living force that sustained them had been damaged. They could not adapt or send out new shoots, for the beasts that had once spread their seeds were gone, and what creatures were left, scrabbling amongst the dirt, could not reach the upper branches of the trees, nor would they wish to feed on such feeble sustenance as the trees could offer. So it was that the trees began to slowly wither, their trunks darkening to black as the living force fled from them entirely. All across the land, from the mountains to the oceans and back, the trees blackened and died until, in no time at all, there was nothing left of the once great forest but a few towering monuments to its folly. The trees had tried to reach too far, had grown too ambitious, and in their quest to acquire knowledge and power, they had sought to become gods, raising up the Fae to serve them. In doing so, however, they had sown seeds of hatred, divisiveness, and fear, and as a consequence their creation had developed spite, bitterness, and a taste for war. Such is the poison that comes with power, for all power corrupts in time and is forever the undoing of those who should know better. This, then, is the story that the silent circle of trees is said to relate to those worthy enough to hear it, in the hope that they might learn from the mistakes of the ancient sentinels, who remain standing even now, a warning to all who come after of the folly of hubris and unchecked curiosity.